all of you will know why we're here this evening, but I've got to do my introduction. Barbara Erskine is the author of 17 best-selling novels and 13 collections of short stories. She studied Scottish history at Edinburgh University, and it was there that she began to first attempt a novel. Whilst working for an educational publisher, and then as the freelance researcher for the books on art and history, she began to sell short stories, and her dream of becoming a full-time writer took hold. Whilst living near Hay-on-Wye, she started working on the research for Lady of Hay, published in 1986, which is the best year, because it was the year I was born, which has now sold over 3 million copies worldwide. This is Barbara's new book, The Valley of Ravens, which many of you have bought already as you came in. Some people in the audience have also already read it, so very keen they were. This evening, in conversation with Barbara, is Alexandra James. Alexandra James first read Lady of Hay when she married a Herefordshire farmer almost 40 years ago. She loved the book, and it became a mission of hers to meet Barbara so she could tell her how much she admired it. Having run Royfield Court for 20 years, she was excited when she booked the Hay Writers' summer lunch, and the guest speaker happened to be Barbara Erskine. They have been firm friends ever since. Alex is an actress and a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company, where she has worked with many wonderful actors. Please welcome Barbara and Alexandra.
Well, as Rusty's just told us, that Barbara has 17 bestsellers, soon to be 18, and I'm very impressed to hear that some of you have read it already, because it's only been on the shelves 1 week. Who's read it already? Well done, you! It's a great story, isn't it? Fantastic, well done. It took me a bit longer than a week to read it, but that was because I savoured the last 2 chapters. Right, of course, you are most famous of all for your very, very first novel, when you started to write it when you were about 25 and it came out when you were about nearly 30, all those years ago. The Lady of Hay, and I'm sure everybody has read that book. Is that correct? Yes. Well, my friends, are you in for a treat reading this book? Because there is an attachment to the Lady of Hay. And when I got to it, luckily, it was early on in the novel. Am I right, madam? You did understand that bit? I couldn't believe it. I thought the Lady of Hay has jumped into this book. How marvellous, wonderful. And I want to ask you, Barbara, what gave you the idea to form this slight attachment in your new book, The Valley of Ravens?
Well, the Valley of Ravens was based around Bilth Wells, which is a sort of slightly north of Hay. And well, I'll tell you what gave me the inspiration for the book, because that was near Bilth, was the monument to Llywelyn, the last native Prince of Wales. And we were visiting the site of the memorial to the battle in which at which Llywelyn died. It's an enormously atmospheric place, and there's a huge granite kind of memorial stone on top of a little hill, and it's just a magical place. But well, what inspired my book was the fact that at the back of this site there are some steps going down to a spring, and the spring is famous because poor Llewellyn lost his head. It was cut off in the battle, and he handed it to someone and said, whoever killed him handed it to someone and said, wash it, before they packed it up to send it to the great enemy, King Edward. And so we went down and we looked at this incredibly moving, they've put it in a tank now, or put a tank over it, the spring. But I was sitting there wondering who had the job of washing the head. What an awful job to do. And that's how the book was born. But all this is happening about 25 minutes drive from Hay. And my heroine, Eve, is, in fact, buys a house, a cottage, a tiny cottage, near Bilth, between Bilth and Hay. So hay has come into the story. It wasn't really planned to be there, but it is there geographically, so it was bound to emerge. And Eve came to that part of the world from Aldborough, which is on the coast of Suffolk, where she lived, and all sorts of awful things happened there, so she wanted to get right away. And she had a friend in Bilth, and that friend was Anne, who's a character in Lady of Hay. And I hadn't planned that, she was exactly the right person in the right place, and was a friend of Eve's. And when Eve was having a really bad time, she said, "Come and stay with me in Wales," hence the story. But if we have Anne in the story, we have to have her best friend, Jo. And Jo, after the trauma and she experienced in Lady of Hay, it occurred to me she must be a much older lady now, mature, shall we say. She was quite young in Lady of Hay starts when she's a student. So I thought, well, you know, Jo's very much a grown-up now, and she lives in Hay. She's gone back to Hay to face the trauma, to sort of lay the ghosts, literally almost. And so she sort of, Anne invites her into the story because Jo is an expert, obviously, on ghosts and things. So that's how they all get together, these three women, the three musketeers, as it were. And the story goes on from there.
Yes, that's very interesting. As you were just saying then, when you're starting to write the story for the very first time, do the characters just come into your mind as the story begins, or have you got it all mapped out beforehand?
It's not, obviously the historical part is mapped out because that's history, and being a history nerd, I always want to try and get it as much right as possible. So I do lots of research, and I love doing the research, so I usually do too much. But when I've got my leading, it's usually a leading lady in the story, in the modern part of the story, I'd roughly work out how they're going to interlink, but not in terrible detail. I wait for it to happen. But I wasn't expecting, I knew she had to have a reason. She had to live in Aldborough. I can't explain that. I just thought, let's get away from Wales for a bit. So Eve lives in Suffolk, and by the end of the chapter, she's driving to Wales. So it kind of happened. But she goes driving, exploring the area a bit, and she comes across this ruin. And the ruin speaks to her, it calls her. And it did the same to me. There's always ruined, quite often, little cottages in my books. They're such a feature of the Welsh landscape, aren't they? These little white cottages that sit in the distance, and when people are doing landscape paintings, there's always one or two in the distance. And this one happened to be in a valley, and in the valley was a cottage and a pair of ravens.
Yes, hence the Valley of Ravens. And this cottage plays a very important part all the way through the ages, and it's set in a valley in Wales. So what is it about Wales that draws you to writing? Because Wales is in a lot of your books.
It's there because my father, well, we've got Welsh ancestors as well as Scots ones, so that's very handy. And I've got an Irish grandmother as well, so it covers the Celtic kind of. My dad he was working in London, and he bought this little tiny ruined cottage. They pop up all over the place in my life. 50, 60 years ago, a long time ago, and he bought it in the mountains just behind Hay. He had this terrible craving. He had to get back to the mountains. I suppose it was what they call hiraeth in Welsh, this longing and love for your homeland. And it was his adopted homeland, but as I said, we have a certain number of Welsh ancestors, and his cousin lived in Brecon, and his brother lived in Caerleon, so there was family all round. And we sort of adopted it as home because from his life and what, he was obviously in the war and everything, we moved around an awful lot and never really felt at home anywhere until this little cottage turned up, and that's very much our home. And that's it. And then I became, having loved the history, having learnt the history based in Scotland, I didn't know very much about the Welsh history. And my first question was, why not? Why do we never hear about Welsh history in English schools? It doesn't exist. Unless you read Shakespeare and, you come across Llewellyn who's a bit of a joke. You just don't hear about Welsh history. There's one or two obviously famous people, like Tom Jones, but no. So I started to read this wonderful history of the battle. Wales was never really a nation. It was a land of lots of separate little principalities and lordships, and some are called kingdoms. And this was the problem, that they all hated each other as much as they hated the English. So when the border wars started for real, which obviously was after the Norman conquest, they had to try and unite. And so we have a very, very beautiful landscape, which is full of history of battles and arguments and more battles, and then they all go away and have a party, and then they marry each other, and then they all fall on each other again because somebody's been rude. And it just goes on, which is sort of echoes in the atmosphere of the hills. It's a very dramatic place, very beautiful.
So let's just go back to when you were a student at Edinburgh University studying history. When was it that you decided actually to be a writer? Because your stories, which are so charismatic and so full of amazing medieval history, were you studying that at the time, or was it a different type of history? Or
no, I studied medieval history, but it's special. I did the Scottish history course because, having a very strong family link with Scotland. But I did start writing because I wanted to write a novel about the time of Robert the Bruce, ironically. I mean, it probably wasn't ironic. It was all planned in the great kind of plan in the sky. But I had roughed out this story. I started to research it. I started to write it, and went off visiting various sites and taking photos, which is a great fun part of the research process. And then very soon I realized that actually, if you're actually studying for a degree, it's actually quite hard work. And you can't, even if it's the same subject you're studying, you can't do both. You can't write a proper novel and get a degree. And there was also other snags. I was 18, I suppose. Yes, I think I was 18. And you're plunging into a most horrifically violent and extraordinary period, the sort of 14th century. That is, and there was me, a little schoolgirl from the country, who'd barely had a boyfriend, never mind knew about the worst parts of being
Heads
a woman.
being chopped off.
And I realized I couldn't do it. I wasn't ready to do it. And I put all this research away in a suitcase under the bed, forgot about it. And it broke my heart because I wanted so much to be a novelist, but it wasn't to be. So anyway, I went on, got my degree, which in Scotland is 4 years. You come out with a master's honours degree, which was brilliant. It was really, really good fun. I enjoyed it. And of course, Edinburgh is a wonderful place to be anyway. But then I did this business of working for an educational publisher. And then I was writing short stories and journalism. You could cope with that. But sadly, the company, which it was so much fun, I loved it. It was based in London, so I could live with my parents who lived there. But they got taken over by a great big American publisher. And, you know, by 6 months we'd all left. We just, yeah, it's such a different kind of way of doing things. And I had this, what I thought was an incredibly good idea of doing the job I'd been doing, which was sort of picture research, editing, all educational books. And I decided I'd go freelance and do it freelance because I'd enjoyed it so much. And I did try some interviews for another job, and I wrote to all these jobs that had said, you know, we're terribly sorry, we almost gave you the job, but... And they all took me as a freelance editor. Brilliant. And so I could phase proper work in and out with writing short stories and writing longer stories and a bit of journalism, travel stuff and things. And I could adjust it as my writing improved and I sold stories. It all fell into place.
And why don't you tell everybody how many times you were turned down with The Lady of Hay?
Yes, I was lucky enough to get an agent through the short stories, and she had asked me if I was writing a novel. And by then I had fixed on The Lady of Hay because it was 4 miles from where my dad's cottage was, and I just loved the history and this funny little market town which was with this enormous socking great castle in the middle. And then the legends were that it was built by a woman in a night, and she carried the stones in her apron, doing womanly things, except she obviously had a foul temper because she hurled the stones across the River Wye from time to time. And she rode with the hounds of hell. She had this fantastic legendary life, but she was also a genuine historical character who was a baron's wife, a Norman baron's wife. And these Norman barons used to go off to war because that was their job basically. But then they'd leave their wives behind to run vast estates and all the stuff that went on, you know, doing that. And this has just intrigued me so much because I'd never thought what the women, you know, her at home was doing while all the lords and chaps went off to fight battles. And there was so much information about her. There really was. It was. She made a very, very large part in history, and you know, I wasn't expecting any of that at all. All I knew was the legends about Hay Castle. So the more I dug, and I had, in those days nothing was online, of course, so you had to go to the actual sources in the reading room at the British Library, which was in those days that wonderful round room in the British Museum, which I loved. And no, it was. I loved the research. I don't think I was in a hurry, but my agent said, right, you know, I want a synopsis, I want so many chapters, I want to be able to show the publishers what you've done. And as Alex said, she showed it to 32 publishers who all said no. And it was interesting, they didn't like medieval history and they didn't like Wales as a subject. It was so unfashionable, isn't that awful? And but I told my agent that I was going to finish it anyway, even if no one ever published it, so there. And I think that gave her the incentive to just go on trying. And then one day, one person said, I think we'll give it a go. And she gave me a little advance and said, finish it.
How wonderful.
Yeah.
So like Julia Roberts in that shop in Pretty Woman, your loss, big time.
It was actually, yes. They all regretted it enormously, turning it down. It's most satisfactory.
Well, it sounds, having read all your books, that you have a huge team of people who investigate and research for you. But that's not the case, is it, Barbara?
No, I do most of my own, all my own research, because I love it so much. That's the best bit. But
do you get yourself in tricky situations?
Yeah, well, you know, you meet people obviously researching, and you meet the most fascinating people, because I'm digging mostly into little sort of corners of history, although there's, in this one, you know, it's a big corner with major characters, but on the whole, they're not very important or well-known characters. I'd had no idea that Matilda de Breos was she was going to be, sadly, not for all the wrong reasons. She was going to be a historical character, but one meets people. With every book I meet different people who very kindly volunteer to help. They all get involved, you know, which is lovely. Either they live in the house where something happened, or they live next door to a house where something happened. And
so you always have
remote
lots of
vicars,
books.
yes.
Lots
Remote
of books to
vicars
write
love
notes.
that. Yes.
You're always writing notes down, and
yes. I have masses of notes. I've learnt to cut down a little bit because you don't need all that information. But over the years, you know, I've got a fantastic library. I've got more books, history books, than our proper library, because, you know, over the years I bought books. And books is best, isn't it? Online, you've got to be able to check what you're reading online, because so often it's wrong, or imaginary, or AI has done its best and worst.
Well, the main characters in the book are Alice, Eve, Llewellyn, and Teg. And by sheer fluke this evening, we have Teg sitting here.
No.
So quiet and so gentle. And when I read the book, my image was this chap here. Who's this? Alfie. Yeah. Well, he's in the book.
But he's bored stiff already.
And nobody's always lying down by the fire, isn't he?
Well, Teg is actually quite a bit bigger than Alfie, and a lot shaggier.
Well, these are the main characters, and in my opinion, Teg, and I'm sure the lady of those read the book will agree with me, is definitely the main character of the book. And there's some really nasty people lurking in the shadows as well. But you told me once that when you start writing a novel, when you get to sort of halfway through, the next novel is hatched before you've even finished writing the one that you are writing.
I don't know about hatched, but it's lurking probably, yes. I have maybe...
What triggers that?
Well, as in this case, it was just seeing the memorial. It can be the most strange thing, you know. When I finished Lady of Hay, it was 10 years it took to write. It was such an enormous kind of enterprise. I had no idea how difficult it would be. And of course, I decided to incorporate a modern story with the historical novel, and that made it. Luckily, I'd done all the research with that because it was based on things that had happened to a friend of mine in Edinburgh. But that story was the castle that set it off, no question.
Because the book you must have been writing was the...
That was the next one, yes. You see, Kingdom of Shadows was the one that was under the bed in the suitcase.
What an amazing mind you have to cope with all this going on in it. Extraordinary.
No, it becomes an obsession for a while. Each book becomes... But the downside of that is that when I do start writing the next one, I've got to put the latest out of my head. And that's quite tricky because one's become so involved with the characters, and, you know, they're part of your kind of... And... It's like a bereavement, really, when I suddenly have to sort of switch them off, shut the door. I literally forget the name of the characters so that I can become as involved in the next book. So after these talks, which are going on for another couple of weeks, I think, and then gone. It's just got to go. And it's real heartbreak, postnatal depression.
Yes, I'm sure you've lived with them for so long.
Yeah.
Takes 2 years to write a novel?
Well, it's 2 years between them, but, you know, obviously the first few months that I spent launching the thing and, well, proofreading and doing all that, and then publicity tour. And then, yes, once I switched off, then I...
Yes, so with The Lady of Hay, which was your first publicity, since you ended up in New York.
Yes.
Went all over America, sold 25 million copies. Why aren't we going to New York?
It's funny, isn't it? Because when it was published, you know, it'd taken such an incredible effort for everyone to get it published for me. And there was no publicity or anything. They didn't want to spend any more money on it. And just going to see what happened. And what happened was I had a phone call saying they want you in Cardiff on television tonight. And sort of, what? That's not part of the deal. I don't do television. Absolutely terrified. And it just went on from there. It was just extraordinary, yes, and ended up with a coast-to-coast tour in America on television in New York. I think a lot of authors feel this, you know. You don't sign up for all this public-facing stuff.
No, because you lead quite a solitary life when you're writing.
Well, one does, doesn't
Yes,
one?
and then suddenly
The
you're
old
exposed.
garret, we're all sitting in a garret.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, this book is a ghost story, and there are no regressions in this book, which is what we actually look for, because we're so used to your regressions.
They're all supposed to have a slightly different way of linking into the paranormal, if you like, different ways, like ghost possession, yes, all sorts of different things, haunted houses that need dealing with, you know. Possession is a good one, that you get, you know, got by a ghost. But I like to think there's a little bit of sort of scariness in the books. But I have so many friends who are sort of in the trade, as it were, that, you know, I've heard so many real stories about hauntings, and that, but this one is a genuine ghost story, yes.
Yes, having read the book, I was lucky to get a copy of it before it came out. And it was the most wonderful sort of healing thing to go to bed early and read another chapter of that marvellous story. It's such a wonderful thing, reading, isn't it? So many people get this wonderful joy of excitement. And to me, reading this one, Barbara's latest book, I just went to bed every day at 8 o'clock at night. And my husband would say, where are you off to? You're off to that book, aren't you? Yes, absolute bliss. But I think probably because I just loved the characters in it. And I loved Teg, who's sitting there. And you obviously have a great love of animals, especially dogs, because they're in an awful lot of your books. In fact, I recognise Teg in another one of your books.
Yes, yeah. No, Teg Desiderata, as her real name is in real life, or was, sadly. She was called Dizzy, of course, which she was. She was just such a wonderful dog. She's a Briard, which is a French sheepdog, quite a large. A friend of mine used to call her the hurtling hearthrug, which describes her exactly. We decided quite early on in her career that she didn't do baths, and you weren't going to argue about that one. But the Briards are very much a one-person dog. They look after their person, and luckily she was mine. I was hers, I should say. And she tolerated my family. Any friends of mine she would allow, and the family she'd allow a little bit more. You know, she would be there for them. But strangers had to really have sort of a complete checkup, and she got to know people quite quickly. But
did she find you, or did you find her?
I found her because we had some very dear friends, French family, and they had one like her. Because they're French, they're farm dogs, and they're excessively bossy and very, very sure that they know the right way to do things. And I didn't realize this. I was completely naive when I got this little ball of fluff. It was so sweet. But these French friends had one, or knew one very, very well. And these dogs were designed to run a farm. You have to tell Mark about this. They would run a farm while the farmer would knock back a bottle of red wine and go to sleep under the hedge, you see. So the dog took charge, and it would do all that had to be done, sort it all out, take the children off to the bus stop, collect them later, see that everything was, wake him up to sort of do anything that the dog couldn't manage, like hauling hay bales around. Absolutely priceless. And I thought this was a complete fabrication when they used to tell us about this. And when I read some more about those dogs, and when I knew we moved into a very isolated house on the coast of Essex, and it was haunted. It was quite a challenge living there, but I wanted a dog that would be a guard dog and look after us. And I remembered the story about this that Guilain used to tell us. And I thought, that sounds rather fun. And I looked it up, and they said these dogs, the Emperor Charlemagne had Briards. He was absolutely besotted with these dogs. So that's where the history came in, you see. So I thought, this is the sort of dog I'd like. And I looked it up, and yes, there were people. They're quite rare in England. I think they still are, because they're quite a handful. But I found a little black puppy, just happened to turn up at the right moment, and I was absolutely lost, yes.
So this house that you lived in before you came to Hay, was that full of ghosts?
Yes, it was. It was an old manor house, and it had been, in fact we saw it in Country Life, and we went to see it and rather fell in love with it, but it was way out of our league, you know, it was, so we drove on. But I think about 2 years later we saw it again being advertised, and the price had halved, which should have been a clue, I think. But in fact there was a massive amount of legal stuff involved with buying it. It had belonged to an American woman, and she'd made an incredibly difficult will, which full of insults for her family and why she wasn't going to leave it to any of them, and she was going to leave it to charity, and the charity had to do this and that, and no one could buy it. And it took my husband, who's a devious soul, to work out how to actually get the legal stuff untied, really. And we bought it in the end. And it had been empty for years and years and years by then. And because it was so isolated, there was no one to warn us that it wasn't quite as empty as we thought.
Yes, I remember when I first met you on that day you came to Broadfield for the Hay Writers' Lunch. I was so excited, ladies and gentlemen, I can't tell you. And Barbara disappeared down into the bottom end of the garden, and all the ladies were saying, where is she, where is she? And I went to look for her, and she was amongst the trees at the bottom of our garden. And she said, oh, I'm fine, I'm absolutely fine, I'm just watching your ghosts. I'd never seen a ghost. I think you have to have be a sort of being to see ghosts. I have felt them, because my house was an ancient 1086 monastery, so it was pretty ancient. I felt them, but I never saw them, but my friend here did.
Well, we can beat you there, because we had Roman foundations in that house, yes. But I think it's because I spend a lot of time alone, and dogs don't count, because dogs can see ghosts, and so can cats, and, you know, they weren't worried, so why should I be? We had quite a lot of ghosty adventures, but this is how I met a lot of the people who became my great friends, who were people who would come and try and talk to the ghosts and sort out their problems and so forth, so that because ghosts don't just sort of happen, they're there for a reason, and usually that's a pretty traumatic reason. You tend not to get wildly happy ghosts. You know, they've come back or haven't gone, is more like, and that there are things that need sorting for them if you get someone who can do it.
But you found somebody, didn't you, to help you?
Yes, well, the outdoor ghost was a Roman soldier, and he was on duty. I mean, several people, that's not just me, lots of people saw these things. And he would stand in the corner of you could just see him out of the corner of your eye, looking absolutely miserable. And he was obviously Roman, you know, in all the gear. And we sort of begged him to go away, and nothing happened. He was there, and then my friend Sue, who was the house healer, came to talk to him. And she apparently got a flea in her ear, and he said he would take orders from women. So that was that. And I happened to be talking about this and told some friends of ours who ran a fruit farm quite close by. And dear David, he was very psychic, very down to earth. He'd been in the army. And he was an officer and retired to run a fruit farm. And he said, why not let me have a go? And he came by appointment to the house, and he wouldn't let us go with him. He went into the herb garden on his own, and he had written a little speech in Latin. Thought, let's get to the heart of this. And it turned out, he came back looking quite pleased with himself, I must say, and it turned out that the chap was there because he was on guard and nobody had ever dismissed him. Can you imagine being that much of a kind of job's worth, really? 2,000 years standing there. Did anyone bring him a sandwich? But anyway, he went and we never saw him again, so it worked, you know, it was lovely. So thank you, David. Yeah.
Good for him. Coming back to the book, your knowledge of the Middle Ages is just stunning, and I love the market scenes of the mulling and the cloth weaving. They all wore these really heavy cloth coats to keep warm in those chilly winters. The herbal remedies, the storage of foods for the bitter winters, the cloth weaving, the smithying, the carpentry. Market days. So I went to Hay Market recently to just see what was going on, and blow me, all those people were there.
And what's more, it's been there for 1,000 years, the market in Hay. Yeah.
Well, do you think the world has stayed the same in rural living, or is it reverting back to the old ways?
Oh no, I think that part of, in a country town, I'm sure there's a market here regularly, is there? But it makes so much sense, doesn't it? Because, I mean, when we first moved to the area, Hay was still, Richard Booth had just bought the castle, I think, back in the 60s, and was thinking of setting up his kingdom and all the bookshops and things. It was a brilliant idea. It was great fun. He was quite a character. But before that, it was a proper sort of, you know, they had cattle markets, and I presume it was Thursdays as well, I don't know, but all these cows would wander through the streets to go to the market, and streets would be knee deep in what cattle do, you know, and it was incredibly rural. Not quite now. When you go to Hay-on-Wye, it is a very, very buzzy commercial, really, tourist centre, but it's matured in all the time we've known it and changed enormously. And you know, I don't know whether it's changed for the better. Yes, it has. There's no cows anymore, but there are very few cattle markets anywhere, I think. You probably know about that.
I do, I know a few. Married to a dairy farmer.
Yeah, but anyway, there's always been the market, because that's where for a start, all the farmers come down from the hills, and they lead incredibly isolated lives, these people, and they bring in those days, they brought their wares down. They brought the cheese, they brought the butter, which they'd all made. They were all busy brewing like mad, lots and lots of hay. Once the farmers' distilleries and breweries and so forth started to fade away, there were 37 pubs in Hay, at least. And it's quite funny, actually, because the house we live in was once the police station, and the idea was that after they got really paralytic, these guys, they often got thrown in the nick, and next morning their wives would come to collect them, which apparently was very, very, they were terrified. No need for punishment.
So Alice is our herbalist who visits her old cottage in the present day as a ghost to meet Eve, who was the lady who's bought the cottage and now lives in it, and also has the same sort of healing powers. The two ladies recognise what each other's, not faults necessarily, but they're very clever healings. The relationship they conjure in both is very moving and very enlightening. Do you know these two ladies in real life?
Oh, in real life? No. No, they're people in their own right. The only character I have ever based on a real life is Merrin, a chap called Merrin, who's a sort of pops into some of the books. He's not in this one, but he was a great friend of my parents, and I do remember him. I mean, I don't know how long ago he died, but he was Merrin, and he was called Merrin. I'd never heard of the name before or since, but in real life. But he's. But the interesting part about these ladies is that the ghost can see forwards, and Alice can see forwards.
And Alice never worries that her cottage has completely changed. She doesn't notice any of that at all. All she's interested in is meeting her version in 2026. It's fascinating. Do you think the historic novel with ghosts and regression is on the wane? Or do you think there will always be space for a good ghost story?
Oh, always. There always has been, hasn't there? I think people love being scared, and that's a shame in a way, but most ghost stories are scary. I'm sure forever they've told ghost stories around campfires at night, you know, and the classic ghost stories, I mean, they go right back hundreds and hundreds of years and probably forever, so I don't think they might change, they might, you know, you probably get ghosts whizzing around in Ferraris these days, I don't know. Why not? They'd probably come to grief in a Ferrari.
Well, there's no stopping you. You're already writing your next bestseller.
Not quite.
And we're getting ready to read it, Barbara. Are we allowed a snippet of this one?
No, well, there's a snippet in the back of the... No, there isn't. Yes, there is, yes. I've got confused, yes, because Valley of Ravens, and then the next one, because I'm still thinking of that as the next one, in the back of the latest edition of Lady of Hay, which I don't think's out yet, the sort of anniversary edition, we've put a chapter from the next book, the one after this one, which, yes, is chapter 1. I had to write in a hurry because they said we want to put it in Lady of Hay. And I said, shit, I haven't started it yet, and words to that effect. And anyway, it's quite a short chapter, but I think it sets the scene.
Wonderful. So it's time now for you to ask some questions. Has anybody got a question for Barbara they'd like to ask? Hello, madam. We're just going to get the mic to you so we can hear you.
Actually, that's quite interesting. I obviously remember the story, you know, really well and what the characters were like. But yeah, I did go back and read it again because I thought, this is bloody good, isn't it? But it's the small details you forget, you know, like I had to try and work out how old Jo would be now. And did I say what she looked like? You know, how did she... I knew the headlines, obviously, but I had to work out again who was who a little bit, because obviously they all kind of changed identities in Lady of Hay, and I had to make sure I got that right. But Jo in the Valley of Ravens has settled in Hay, bought herself a little house there, and there is a sort of very small guest appearance from Nick, her kind of, what's he called? Her lover, her protagonist, her kind of... He's an ongoing character in Lady of Hay, and we don't quite know what happens. So there's a big gap, which we'll fill in a little bit more as we go. But I had to sort of play that one. So I thought Nick is still a very sexy guy. Now we're all older, you know, he can still do it.
Another question, anybody? Yes, sir.
I've read 3 books. That's all right, I don't think I need that for anyone else. Oh, sure. 3 books that you've written. Well, the latest one is the 3rd one, which I haven't finished yet. And they're all, you know, there's a central female character who's mirrored with somebody in history. I love them, by the way, I absolutely love them. But I was wondering how difficult it is to differentiate between characters from book to book. Do you find yourself thinking, oh, this character's saying just the same things as and having to sort of hold yourself back? And I was wondering, do you have techniques for keeping every individual character different? Because they always are. I mean,
well, that's a relief. It's a very good point, actually, because it worries me. It was sort of coming up to book 18, you know. But what I do when as I said, I just have to forget the characters that are gone and, you know, concentrate on a new one and hope that they are different and very different and their experiences are so different. But because to me they're real people, you know, they just like your friends, you know, that they're all slightly different. Some of them are similar, some of them are not. I think I rely on that as working, because to me they come alive. They're real people, and they do what real people do, which is sometimes a bit kind of, you know, unexpected. But it's a very good point, you know, it does worry me, and I hope that my publisher, well, not my publisher because she's quite new, but the people who edit the book, one hopes that they will, but I don't think they've read them all, so you know, I have more problems with some of the techniques, as I was telling people. When I first wrote The Valley of Ravens, my editor read it and said, "Did you realise you've got Christmas Day 3 times?" So you see, the run up to Christmas was so important. I kept getting there, but that's what an editor does. Of course, they hopefully catch anything that doesn't sort of read quite right. But I mean, you know, what you say is a very interesting point, and one just hopes that they're. I think in this next one, the main characters are going to be that little bit older, because, you know, it's 40 years since Lady of Hay, and I don't know whether it's that much that they've aged, but no, because they've got to still get a bit of energy going, you know.
Of course you do. You've got lots of energy.
Yeah, but the interesting part is having Lady of Hay in the background, hovering, obviously, but not actually. You've got to prompt people who haven't read it to understand where the allusions come to it, without getting boring, because most people have read it, but they might have read it so long ago, like me, that they can't actually remember some of the details. So that's going to be quite tricky, I think.
I'm actually just rereading at the moment, and it's such a joy to go back to these stories that it's taken me 40 odd years to get through, and it's just a joy to read. I've just read The Dreamweavers. Anyone read The Dreamweavers? Oh, well done, sir, you have. I mean, it's all about Hereford Cathedral, and it's on our doorstep. It is the most wonderful story, and I've been in that blooming chapel so many times trying to find that little ghost. You've seen her, but I've yet to see her, but maybe I will one day. Any more questions?
I had the wonderful help with that from Chris Pullen, who was the Chancellor of the Cathedral, and was also the head of Deliverance, which is a sort of ghost-busting arm of the Church of England. And so, you know, he was kind of vetting what I was saying. So people who say, you know, the church is not putting up with any of this, they're fully geared up for such things. So,
when you are researching books, what do you enjoy reading in terms of genre, and do you have a favourite author yourself to read?
research does take up an awful lot of my reading time, I have to say. But my current favourite, well, one of them is Ellie Griffiths. I'm sure you've all read her. I loved her archaeologist characters. And the interesting part is that, in fact, I met her last year and we spent ages talking, and she was telling me about the book she was writing at the time, which is, I can't remember what they're called now. You probably know her new one. Do you know?
Off the top of my head,
No.
it's a bad bookseller.
Anyway, she is doing a sort of dual timeline in it, past and, in fact, a Victorian past and a present day. But the link here is scientific and chemical and deliberate, and the government are researching doing this, which is a brilliant twist on the sort of format. So, which I loved, absolutely wonderful. So we got on rather well discussing that, because I like mine to be paranormal in the way that they join, which is something you can do yourself at home. But her stuff was very, very technical, but it's a super story.
Any more questions? Yes.
You touched upon your personal experiences with paranormal and spirits. Have you ever had a particularly impactful spiritual experience yourself, which you thought, that's hit me so hard, I need to have that as part of my story?
That's a very interesting question, actually. I have written a short story which was very much based on something that happened in a house we lived in years and years and years ago. But on the whole, not really, because the experiences I have had have been disjointed. One doesn't know the background of what's going on. I mean, obviously we guessed with the Roman soldier, because that's pretty obvious, but there was a child ghost in the manor house in Essex, and we did actually, a friend of mine who jolly nearly wasn't a friend after that, he decided to research it and wanted to make a television program about it. And I very much didn't want him to and asked him not to. And then we found he'd put it up on YouTube or something. But that was an incredibly sad story about this child who died young. And but he did do a lot of research, to give him credit, and found out, well, her death and burial was recorded in the church, which was just next door to our house. And we could see her grave and put flowers on it. But that was a story, but I haven't written it. It was really too moving and too involving a child. Is difficult. But I think it's more the emotions and the feelings and the way that they present themselves and what happens. I use that a lot, obviously. And as I'm linking it into a historical, I don't know if Llewellyn haunts anywhere. I haven't heard that he does, but I wouldn't be surprised. But he's a ghost in my story. I think this is it. It's more a matter of technique and experiences. But the actual history, because I love history, I try and link it into something historical, so to give it an anchor. But I think, so many people have seen ghosts, or whatever you like to call them, or feel things, and usually, in an event like this, somebody says, I don't tell people about this usually, but I'll tell you now, and then they tell 100 people quite happily about events that have happened to them. And it's so common, that everybody, well, not everybody, but an awful lot of people have experiences that I think they can identify when I write about them.
I just wanted to ask something before we finish, because the time's nearly up, but I think it's quite important, because being an old goat, which is what my children call me, I don't understand, I'm beginning to understand about AI, as are you, because just a few days ago I did a play reading of a new play, and the director went away for half an hour, came back, and played me the recording of my voice in Much Ado About Nothing. It had absolutely nothing to do with the play that I had just read. What on earth is that all about? It's so clever. How is that going to affect writers with their books?
There was a major panic with authors because they discovered their books were being used to train AI. And, you know, we were told where to look it up, and 17 bits of my writing were used by whatever it is in America, with, of course, no acknowledgement or payment or anything. People are fighting this, but, and presumably there's a little sort of Barbara Erskine somewhere writing as hard as she can go without my knowledge. But apparently they're getting better and better. The market's being flooded with AI-written books. And, you know, we've just got to either live with it or find a way of stopping it. Well, you'll never stop any of it, I don't think. You do hear in the news this morning, they were talking about they're creating viruses. Well, that's supposed to be for good, but can you imagine what happens when someone hacks a system? It's so scary. And it's spoiling life, isn't it? You want to sit down with a pen in your hand and do proper writing,
Well, Barbara,
even if you use a keyboard.
You will live forever with us
Well,
and our hearts and our books and stuff AI, whatever it is. I know it's very clever and brilliant and all the rest of it, but to infringe on your talent and to be used is not fair, especially when you've been doing it for 50
They're doing it with
years.
painting as well. I mean, they're producing sort of original Rembrandts and things, you know. Oh yeah, and they because they study the different kinds of paint and they use old canvas and I mean, there's nothing. They'll be writing Shakespeare's plays. I think there's loads of them that haven't yet been discovered. It's an absolute. Well, I don't know. I suppose our children and grandchildren will learn how to live with it, won't they? And cope, I suppose.
So, ladies and gentlemen, our very special Barbara.
To the wonders of technology, I very quickly went on to fantastic fiction, and the Ellie Griffiths books are called the Ali Dawson Mysteries. So there you go. Let me tell you a quick story, because Barbara has been very good to Ross books over the years, and during COVID, if anyone remembers that horrible time in our lives, we had loads of people contacting us wanting Barbara's new book signed, and it was the Dreamweavers came out in 2021. And so we contacted Barbara to see if she would sign some for us, and during lockdown I filled my car. I don't know if you remember this. I filled my car with books, I drove to her house in Ross-on-Wye, and in her garden we signed tons and tons and tons of books at a distance, so that people could still get signed copies. And I think that's the kind of dedication and the kind of amazing thing that authors bring to the table that AI will never be able to do. So I hope that you've enjoyed this evening as much as I have. We have the new book. Many of you have already bought it, but we take £3 of your ticket money off if you want to. And Barbara will be signing books just over here on this table. So if you've already got it, please join that. But thank you very much for coming. But last of all, would you join me in thanking Alexandra and Barbara Erskine?